Okay, we're learning Perek Beis Halacha Hey. Hilchos Megillah b'lo kavona lo yotza. So you read the Megillah without kavona, he's not yotza. So let's see what the Peirush says. We go down. Hilchos Megillah b'lo kavona lo yotza. Ketzad. He wrote it, or he was studying it, or he was verifying its correctness of text. Im kiven es libo elotzeis b'kri yezu. If he was mechaven, he had intent to be yotze with that reading. Then Yotze, even Libel Yotze, but if he didn't make it, have intent, he's not Yotze. The Magen Mishnah cites Megillah, Zion 17a. He was writing it, or Dorsha, or studying it, or Magia, or editing it. If he had intent, he's Yotze, or not, he's not Yotze. The Rambam explains Kivan Liboy. He explains the idea of having his heart intent, meaning to be fulfill his obligation, just like he writes in Hilchos Shofar, Perek Beis Halacha Daled. You need kavana to be yotzei, the mechavis mitzvah, and the Magen Mishnah says maybe those who feel that mitzvahs don't need kavana would agree that Bekriyas Megillah you need kavana to be in order to fulfill your obligation. So that's the question here. Even if mitzvahs are not shlius kavana, because that's the way it was intended to be done. Rabbi Chodesh Tshuvas Radvaz explain the reasoning that because Pirsumin so that's why you have to have intent. Now we're going to the Torah at the bottom, who in 690 says, the person has to have intent when he reads it. The Beis Yosef says that he closes, in other words, he made it a closed statement, just like the Rosh, that mitzvahs need to have kavana. That we find in 589 by Shofar. Shulchan Aruch Paskins, if somebody reads the Megillah, has to have intent to be moitzi the person who's listening. It's a separate aspect of intent to read it for the purpose of the mitzvah, and intent to fulfill the obligation of others. We'll turn the page. If Kalavu Misnamnim, the Rambam says if he's reading it and he's there that drowsy, near them, as long as he didn't fall asleep, it's okay. Magen Mishnah cites the Mishnah. The Gemara in 18b explains what does it mean misnamnim, somebody who's drowsy. Nim v'loy nim, tir v'loy tir, meaning that you speak to him and he answers you, but he doesn't know to explain things. And when you remind him, he does remind him. That's why the Rambam says that he didn't fall entirely asleep. In other words, he's about to fall asleep if you would let him sleep, but at the moment he is cognizant of what you say to him. And so the Torah in 690 says, and the Beis Yosef adds to the Mordcha, the name of the Yerushalmi in Megillah, that Menashe was sitting before Abzera and he was drowsy at the time they read the Megillah. So he said to him, you didn't have intent to be Yotzei. The Mordechai says there could be that there's no disagreement with the Mishnah that if he read it and he says it with his mouth, he would fulfill his obligation even though he's drowsy. But if you're listening and you're drowsy, then it's different, because maybe you didn't hear one word. If you say all the words, even though you're falling asleep, it's okay. That the Shibud Aleket writes in the name of Rabbeinu Simcha. Hilchos Megillah, Ram Paskins. If somebody fell asleep in the middle of the Suda and he woke up, you can't eat from the Korban Pesach. This is when they had the Korban Pesach. However, Bnei Chabura, the whole group was sleeping, part of the group was sleeping in the Suda, then you can't continue to eat, because those who are up can make it that this meal is still in full swing. Nirdimu. V'noiru lo yechlu. But if they all fell asleep and they woke up, it's no good. Nisnamnu kulam yechlu. But if they're all drowsy, they can eat. And there too, they make the difference between falling asleep by a meal, which that's possible, even though you're sitting there, you're not there any longer because you're sleeping, and you have Pesach Hadas from the Korban Pesach, you can't eat, or you are drowsy and when you're spoken to, you awaken. Shulchan Aruch paskins that the halacha is, if he read it when he's drowsy, since he didn't fall asleep totally, he's yotze. If he heard it when he's drowsy, he wasn't yotze. Now you see why the Rambam, Mishnah, by the Shulchan Aruch makes this differentiation. The Mishnah Berurah explains that if he read it when he's falling asleep, he's yotze, because he can have intent to be yotze. Because mitzvahs tzrichas kavona, mitzvahs need kavona. V'chein, also, the one who listens to the Megillah and he's falling asleep is yotze if he's saying the words from his, like the Miri says, what? And therefore, because if you're hearing it from someone who's falling asleep, you're yotze if you can hear the words. And even though the person who's falling asleep has to have intent to fulfill your obligation, it could be that somebody who's drowsy can have that intent in mind. Furthermore, it would seem that it's talking about that he began reading when he wasn't drowsy and became drowsy in the middle. Therefore, the fact that he had intent is enough to make it valid to continue. That his reading that he continues fulfills your obligation. Now we're going to Perek Beis Halacha Vov. Rambam says, "B'med v'amurim." When is this so? When he has intent with his heart, when he's writing, when he wants to be yotze with the kriya that he reads in the sefer, that he is reading from. Remember, what he's doing when he writes is he's copying that which he found in a different sefer, just like the sefer do today. The scribes look in one sefer and they write in the second one. The one they're writing in, you can't be yotze from because it's not a complete sefer. But since you're reading from the first one, that's what we're talking about. We'll go down below, and but if he didn't have intent to be yotze with what he read from the first sefer, only he wanted to have from the new one that he's writing, he's not yotze, because you cannot be yotze, fulfill your obligation from a Megillah which is not totally written b'shas kriya, even though by the time you get to the end of the Megillah, it's totally written. You read the whole Megillah, because you have to have a whole sefer that you read it from. Nagor's Maimon cites Megillah 18b, and it's talking about that he has in front of him a Megillah that's already written, and he's copying from it, and he reads every pasuk from the Megillah that's written completely, and therefore he's yotze. The Mishnah adds that the Megillah has to be kosher that he's reading from and made correctly, the first one. The Gemara in Megillah 18 and B adds, this is a Rae to Rambam B'Chano, Rabbi Yochanan. You can't write a Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzahs, one ois, not from something that's written. But he has to have always something in front of him and right from there. And even a Megillah, it has to be in front of him, and from that he should write, even if he has a photographic memory. And he pushes off this thought, because it could be that the Mishnah is talking about that he happens to be writing from a sefer, but it doesn't mean that he has to do so. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, if he was writing a Megillah, and he read a pasuk from the Megillah that he's copying from, and he writes it, if he had intention to fulfill his obligation with the reading that he read from the old one, he's yotze. That's only from the one that he's copying from, because he had a complete Megillah that he's copying from. And there are more adds that it has to be in front of him that he's copying from. But one can push into the words of the Rambam that he happened to have a sefer, that he's copying from the sefer, but he doesn't have to do so. But from his lashon, from his actual language, it would seem that that's the way you write it. And Hilchos Megillah says it's mutter to write a tefillin and mezuzahs without copying from a sefer that's written in front of him. Because all those who edit parashas and they're used to it in his mouth, then you can write it that way. But Sefer Torah, you can't write it. In other words, the parashat tefillin are all known and everybody knows every word. But Sefer Torah, you can't read even one ois, not from something that's already written. From Divrei HaMor, we learn that even a Megillah has to be written from something that has already previously been written.